I think every strong woman in history has had to walk down a similar path, and I think it's the strength that causes the confusion and the fear.
Just after dawn, a sealed room was opened for the first time in decades. What the staff expected to find was history. What they uncovered instead rewrote it. The room that time forgot. It happened just after dawn, on a gray winter morning, when the light outside Kensington Palace barely seemed strong enough to justify waking the city. Most of the building was still quiet. Corridors echoed softly with the sound of early footsteps, and the smell of polish and old stone hung in the air. This was not a ceremonial opening. There were no cameras, no announcements, no senior royals present, just a small group of trusted palace staff standing before a door that had remained closed for decades. The room had once belonged to Diana, not a public space, not a reception room remembered from photographs or state occasions. This was one of her private rooms, sealed shortly after her death in the late 1990s, catalogued, archived, and then quietly removed from daily palace life. Over the years, it became something else entirely. Not forgotten exactly, but untouched. A place spoken about in hushed tones, referenced in internal documents with careful language, and avoided whenever possible. That morning, the decision to open it again felt heavy in a way no routine task ever does. The order had come quietly, folded into a broader internal review tied to ongoing modernization and archival verification. On paper, it was procedural, a reassessment of long-sealed rooms to ensure records matched reality. In practice, everyone involved understood this was different. Diana's name still carried a gravity that bent protocol to its will. Even decades later, even after countless documentaries, books, and inquiries, her private world remained volatile territory. The key turned slowly. When the door opened, the air inside felt colder than the hallway, stale and undisturbed, as if time itself had paused the moment it was shut. Dust clung to the edges of furniture. Heavy curtains muted the already pale morning light. Nothing looked dramatic at first glance. No chaos, no obvious disturbance. Just a room preserved in a strange, suspended stillness. But almost immediately, something felt off. One staff member later described it as the sensation you get when a familiar story suddenly skips a page. The layout was correct. The furnishings were consistent with photographs of the inventory taken decades earlier. Yet the room did not feel complete in the way an untouched space should. There were gaps, subtle ones, the kind you don't notice unless you're trained to notice absence. A senior archivist paused near the writing desk, running a gloved hand along its surface. Another stood silently near the wardrobe, comparing the scene before her to a printed inventory list she held close to her chest. No one spoke at first. Palace culture teaches restraint. You do not speculate aloud. You observe. You verify. Then someone broke the silence. "This isn't matching," she said quietly. The words landed harder than anyone expected. As the staff moved further into the room, the unease deepened. Items that should have been logged as removed decades ago were still present. Others, noted in multiple official records as remaining in situ, were nowhere to be found. The inconsistencies were minor individually, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. This was no longer about sentiment. What unsettled the staff most was not what they could see, but what the discrepancies implied. Rooms like this are not casual spaces. Every object, every document, every personal item associated with Diana had been catalogued repeatedly since her death and reviewed by archivists, cross-checked by legal teams and protected by layers of institutional caution shaped by painful experience. For something to be out of place now meant one of two things. Either the records were wrong, or someone had, at some point, accessed this room when they were not supposed to. A hush settled over the group as that realization took hold, the kind of silence that follows when routine quietly transforms into something far more serious. One staff member stepped back toward the door, instinctively checking the corridor beyond, as if the building itself might be listening. Within minutes, the discovery escalated, not loudly, not dramatically, just a measured phone call, a careful message sent through secure internal channels. The room was to remain sealed again immediately. No further examination until authorization was expanded, no discussion outside a tightly defined circle. As the door closed once more, the staff exchanged brief, uneasy glances. They had expected memories. What they found instead was uncertainty. And in a palace built on control, uncertainty is the one thing that never goes unnoticed. Why the door was finally opened. The decision to reopen the room did not begin with curiosity, nor nostalgia, nor any sudden desire to revisit the past. It started, as most consequential palace actions do, with paperwork. Quiet, procedural, unremarkable on its surface. In the final weeks of November, as part of a more exhaustive internal modernization review ordered under King Charles's ongoing restructuring agenda, senior administrators were instructed to reconcile sealed spaces with updated archival standards. The mandate was technical, almost boring in its phrasing: verify, confirm, align. But buried within that directive was a clause that changed everything. All restricted rooms were to be reviewed for compliance, regardless of historical sensitivity. For years, Diana's private rooms had existed in a kind of protected limbo. They were neither fully preserved as public heritage nor dismantled as obsolete space. Instead, they sat outside the rhythm of the palace, acknowledged but untouched. That status had been tolerated under Elizabeth's reign, where continuity often took precedence over clarification. But Charles's monarchy operates differently. His advisors have long argued that ambiguity is a liability in the modern era. Spaces that exist outside formal record-keeping create risk, not romance. And Diana's name, however revered, could no longer exempt a physical room from institutional accountability. There was also pressure coming from an unexpected direction. In the months leading up to winter, palace archivists had flagged several minor inconsistencies across sealed inventories from the late 1990s and early 2000s. Most were mundane: a misdated photograph, a storage box logged twice under different codes. But taken together, they suggested something larger. The transition period following Diana's death, chaotic and emotionally charged, may not have been as meticulously controlled as official narratives implied. No one suggested wrongdoing aloud, but the idea that some records were frozen prematurely, never fully reconciled, began to circulate quietly among senior staff. Another factor, rarely discussed publicly, was generational distance. Many of the individuals who had overseen Diana's immediate posthumous arrangements were no longer in service. Some had retired, others had passed away. With their absence came a subtle shift in authority. Decisions once protected by personal loyalty were now being reviewed by people with no emotional attachment to those moments. For them, Diana was not a lived experience. She was a historical figure whose legacy needed to be managed with clarity rather than reverence. That distance made the unthinkable suddenly possible. Timing mattered too. The monarchy had entered a sensitive phase. Catherine's reduced public schedule, Charles's health considerations, and ongoing international scrutiny meant the institution was already operating under heightened awareness of reputational risk. In that environment, unresolved questions become dangerous. Advisors argued that it was better to uncover inconsistencies internally than to have them exposed later through speculation or leaks. Diana's legacy had taught the palace one brutal lesson above all others: silence only protects you until it doesn't. Approval to open the room was not given lightly. It required multiple sign-offs, each phrased carefully to avoid unnecessary alarm. Legal counsel reviewed the request. Senior archivists prepared contingency protocols. Even then, the authorization was deliberately narrow. No broad exploration, no removal of items, simple verification, confirmation that the room matches its final recorded state. The hope, unspoken but shared, was that the process would be uneventful, that the door would open, the records would align, and the room could be resealed without consequence. For the staff assigned to the task, the responsibility felt heavier than the paperwork suggested. Many of them had grown up during the Diana years. They remembered the shock, the grief, the unresolved questions that followed her death. Being asked to step back into that physical space felt less like routine duty and more like crossing a boundary. Several later admitted they slept poorly the night before, not because they expected a scandal, but because they understood symbolism. Some doors, once opened, have a way of changing the atmosphere around them. What no one said aloud but everyone sensed was that this moment marked a quiet shift in how the monarchy related to its own past. For decades, Diana's story had been treated as exceptional, too emotionally charged to be handled like any other chapter. But institutions cannot survive on exceptions forever. Modernization, by its nature, forces confrontation with what has been preserved too carefully and what has been left unresolved. Opening the room was not an act of intrusion. It was an admission that time had passed, and with it, the obligation to ensure that history rested on fact rather than assumption. By the time the key was issued and the corridor cleared, the decision was already irreversible. Whatever waited behind that door would be seen not as memory, but as record. And that distinction, subtle as it sounds, was precisely why the room had remained closed for so long. What was found, and why it shocked everyone. At first, the discovery did not announce itself dramatically. There was no single object that immediately explained the tension that settled over the room. What unsettled the staff was the gradual realization that the space did not behave as sealed rooms are supposed to, and time had not frozen cleanly here. It had been interrupted. The longer they stood inside, the clearer it became that this was not simply a preserved snapshot of a moment in Diana's life. It was a space that had been revisited, adjusted, and then quietly closed again. The first discrepancy appeared at the writing desk near the window. According to archival records dated to the autumn of 1997, the surface should have been cleared entirely, its contents boxed and relocated to secured storage. Instead, a slim leather folder sat inside the center drawer, its edges softened by age but unmistakably handled long after the room was supposedly sealed. The folder bore no external markings, no catalog number, no accession label. For a palace archive, that absence alone was enough to trigger concern. When the folder was opened under supervision, it revealed neatly stacked pages, handwritten in Diana's distinctive slanted script. Not letters addressed to anyone, but personal notes, observations, fragments of thought. This kind of writing is never meant for public consumption or official record. The staff froze. These were not the documents cited repeatedly in posthumous inventories. These pages did not appear in any known index, and yet here they were, resting quietly in a room no one was meant to have entered for decades. As the discovery sank in, attention turned to what was missing. Along the back wall stood a wardrobe whose contents had been meticulously photographed in the late 1990s. Several garments listed in those photographs were gone. Not removed haphazardly, but selectively. Evening dresses remained, casual clothing remained, but a small group of items associated with specific periods of Diana's life, trips, or personal upheavals had vanished. The implication was subtle but chilling. Someone had not taken everything. They had taken something. Near the bedside table, another inconsistency emerged. A framed photograph described in the inventory as permanently displayed was absent, its outline faintly visible in the dust where it had once stood, and in its place sat nothing. No replacement, no attempt to disguise the removal. That detail disturbed the archivists more than the missing garments. It suggested confidence. Whoever accessed the room had not expected scrutiny. They had not bothered to cover their tracks. Then there was the lockbox. According to official records, it had been emptied and transferred to a secure vault shortly after Diana's death. Yet beneath the bed, pushed back far enough to escape casual notice, sat a smaller container bearing an older security seal. When it was carefully retrieved, staff immediately noticed the seal had been replaced, not recently, but years after the original closure. The numbering did not match any of the logs. This was not a clerical error, it was an intervention. Inside the lockbox were photocopies, not originals, legal correspondence, medical notes, schedules with handwritten annotations, documents that hinted at private concerns and unresolved tensions, but stopped short of explicit accusation. What shocked staff was not the content itself, but the curation. These were copies deliberately preserved, separated from the originals that had presumably been archived elsewhere. It was as if someone had wanted to retain a shadow record, something parallel to the official story. The room continued to reveal its quiet contradictions. A calendar on the wall had been turned to a later month than the date the room was sealed. A lamp showed signs of use that post-dated the final inventory. Even the scent in the air, faint but present, suggested human presence long after the supposed closure. None of these details alone would have been alarming. Together, they painted a picture that was impossible to dismiss. What truly rattled the staff was the timeline. The alterations did not appear recent. They suggested access in the early 2000s, perhaps even later, a period when the palace was still reeling from public scrutiny, lawsuits, and shifting internal alliances. The idea that Diana's private space had been quietly revisited during that volatile era raised uncomfortable questions. Who had the authority? Who had the motive? And who had decided that certain pieces of her story were too dangerous to leave untouched? No one spoke openly about it, but the fear was palpable. This was not about sentimental keepsakes, it was about narrative control. Diana's life and death had already reshaped the monarchy once. If evidence emerged that her private records had been selectively curated outside formal process, the implications would be severe. Not because of scandal alone, but because it suggested the institution had not merely responded to history, but edited it. Within minutes, the protocol shifted. The room was no longer a verification site. It became a containment zone. Staff stopped cataloging and began documenting the state of discovery itself. Photographs were taken, times logged, observations recorded with clinical detachment. The door was closed again before any further examination could take place. This was no longer a matter for archivists alone. It had crossed into something far more sensitive. As they stepped back into the corridor, the staff carried with them a shared understanding that something fragile had been disturbed. Diana's room had not yielded a single explosive revelation. It had done something more unsettling. It had been revealed that parts of her story were still unsettled, still guarded, and still powerful enough to make the palace hold its breath decades later. The institutional alarm. The response within the palace was swift but not loud. There were no emergency meetings announced, no sudden shifts in public schedules, no visible signs that anything unusual had occurred. Instead, the machinery of the institution adjusted in near silence, the way it does when something is deemed too sensitive to acknowledge even internally without precision. Within hours of the room being resealed, the discovery was elevated beyond archival review and placed into a restricted advisory channel reserved for matters with legal, constitutional, and reputational implications. The first calls were made to senior household officers whose roles existed primarily out of public view. These were individuals accustomed to handling crises before they reached the surface, people who understood that timing could determine outcome. They reviewed the preliminary findings with careful neutrality, focusing not on speculation, but on exposure. Their immediate concern was not what the materials contained, but who might have known about them and when they might have known it. In a palace that functions on authorization chains, any unaccounted access is a breach regardless of intent. Legal counsel was brought in next, not to assess blame, but to assess risk. The materials discovered in Diana's room fell into a legal gray area. Handwritten notes, photocopied documents, and personal annotations occupy a complicated position within royal record-keeping. Some fall under private estate law, others intersect with historical documentation protocols. If mishandled, they could become discoverable in future inquiries, or leveraged in ways the monarchy could not control. The legal team's recommendation was immediate containment until provenance could be established beyond doubt. At the same time, senior archivists expressed a different anxiety. For decades, the palace had assured the public, historians, and even Diana's own sons that her personal effects had been comprehensively catalogued. That assurance had been repeated often enough to become an institutional fact. The realization that some materials may have existed outside that system threatened to undermine the credibility of the entire archival process. If one exception were proven, critics would assume others existed as well. The most difficult conversations centered on authority. The timeline suggested that any unauthorized access occurred during a period of internal upheaval, when oversight structures were strained and public pressure was relentless. That raised an unspoken but unavoidable question. Were the alterations the result of individual discretion, or were they tacitly sanctioned in the name of damage control? The difference mattered profoundly. One implied a breach of protocol, the other implied institutional complicity. Senior aides were instructed to review access logs from the relevant years, though many were incomplete or stored under outdated systems. Some security records had been archived under formats no longer in use. Others had been consolidated following administrative reforms. The search itself became a reminder of how much the palace had evolved since Diana's death, and how much of that evolution had been driven by crisis rather than foresight. Every missing log felt like a gap the institution could no longer afford to leave. Word of the discovery reached the highest levels cautiously, filtered through layers of restraint. It was presented not as a revelation, but as an anomaly requiring evaluation. Still, the reaction was unmistakable. This was not a matter that could be delegated indefinitely. Diana's legacy remains uniquely destabilizing, precisely because it intersects with public trust, personal grief, and unresolved narrative tension. Anything that suggested her story had been selectively managed reopened wounds the monarchy had spent decades trying to close. The communications team was consulted, not to draft a statement, but to plan for the possibility that one might someday be necessary. They analyzed scenarios ranging from accidental leaks to intentional disclosures and mapped potential responses. The conclusion was sobering. Any revelation involving Diana, regardless of its substance, would be interpreted through suspicion. The institution's margin for error was non-existent. Silence could be read as concealment. Transparency could be read as admission. Behind all of this ran a quieter fear. If materials had been removed, copied, or curated outside official channels, there was no guarantee they had not been duplicated further. Somewhere, possibly outside palace control, pieces of Diana's private record could exist in unknown hands. That possibility, more than any single document, set off the actual alarm. The monarchy had learned the hard way that once information escaped containment, it could not be recalled. By the end of the day, a provisional decision was made. No further access to the room until a joint review by legal, archival, and senior household authorities can be completed. No expansion of scope. No internal discussion beyond those explicitly cleared. The goal was stabilization, not resolution. Buy time. Reduce risk. Understand the boundaries of what had been found before determining what, if anything, should follow. As night fell, the palace returned to its outward calm. Lights glowed softly behind tall windows. Staff completed their rounds. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing had shifted. But inside the institution, an alarm had been triggered, one that did not ring audibly but resonated deeply. Diana's room had reminded the monarchy of an uncomfortable truth. The past is not inert, it waits, and when disturbed it demands far more care than anyone ever expects. Diana's shadow in the present day. No matter how much time passes, Diana remains unfinished business for the monarchy. Not as a scandal, not as a myth, but as a force that still bends decisions long after her physical presence disappeared. Inside the palace, her name does not surface casually. It carries weight, history, and consequence. What was found in her former room did not shock staff because it was sensational in nature. It shocked them because it reminded everyone how little control the institution has ever truly had over Diana's narrative, and how easily that narrative can destabilize the present. For William, the implications were deeply personal, though his response was characteristically restrained. He has spent his entire adult life navigating the tension between honoring his mother's memory and protecting the institution she once challenged simply by existing within it. Diana's vulnerability, her openness, her refusal to be quietly managed, had reshaped the monarchy in ways no policy reform ever could. The idea that parts of her private world had been curated without transparency reopened questions William believed had been settled through time, restraint, and careful distance. Charles's relationship to Diana's legacy is more complicated, layered with regret, defensiveness, and historical re-examination. He has lived long enough to see public opinion swing back and forth, casting him alternately as villain, victim, and relic of an older system. For him, the discovery in that room was not merely administrative. It was a reminder that the choices made in moments of crisis echo far beyond their original intent. Any suggestion that Diana's story had been shaped behind closed doors threatened to reopen judgments he had worked decades to outgrow. Senior aides understood immediately why this moment felt different from previous Diana-related revelations. This was not a book, not a leaked tape, not a second-hand account filtered through memory or grievance. This was physical evidence, objects, documents, gaps, the kind of details that resist reinterpretation. In an era when public trust is fragile and institutions are expected to justify not just their actions but their histories, the presence of unanswered questions is dangerous. The discovery also landed amid a broader climate of sensitivity. Catherine's health-related absence from public life had already heightened scrutiny. The monarchy operated in a moment when stability was not assumed but actively managed. Against that backdrop, Diana's shadow felt heavier. She represents a time when emotion overwhelmed structure, when silence failed, and when the palace underestimated the cost of withholding truth. No one wanted to repeat that mistake, yet no one wanted to invite the chaos that truth can unleash. What unsettled staff most was the realization that Diana's private life continues to mirror modern tensions. The same forces that complicated her position, then media pressure, narrative control, and institutional self-protection, are still very much alive today. The monarchy has changed in form, but not entirely in instinct. That continuity made the discovery feel less like a historical anomaly and more like a cautionary echo. There was also the unspoken comparison many dared not articulate. Diana's openness, her vulnerability, and her complicated relationship with the press stand in contrast to the institution's now favored controlled, minimal visibility. William's generation has learned from her pain, but it has also reacted against it, choosing restraint where she chose exposure. The fear, quietly shared, was that reopening Diana's private record could blur that carefully constructed boundary, inviting emotional narratives the palace no longer knows how to manage. Beyond the immediate family, the institution grappled with a broader question. Does the monarchy owe the public a complete account of its past, or does it owe itself the right to preserve internal complexity without explanation? Diana's life sits precisely at that crossroads. She belongs to history, but she also belongs to memory, and memory does not obey institutional rules. Once discrepancies are acknowledged, expectations follow. Clarification becomes a demand. The most difficult truth to confront was this: Diana's influence has never been confined to her lifetime. It persists because it represents unresolved tension between humanity and hierarchy. What was found in her room did not threaten the monarchy because of its contents. It threatened it because of what it symbolized. That some stories resist closure, that control is often an illusion, and that even decades later, Diana remains capable of shifting the emotional gravity of the crown. As winter pressed on, those involved understood that whatever came next would have to be handled with extraordinary care. Not because Diana needs protection, but because the present does. Her shadow stretches across every decision where truth and restraint collide, and in that shadow, the monarchy must decide whether it has learned enough from the past to face it honestly, or whether it will once again choose silence and hope time does the rest. What happens now? In the days following the discovery, the palace settled into a familiar but uneasy rhythm. Outwardly, nothing changed. Engagements continued, schedules held, statements remained carefully neutral. But beneath that surface, decisions were being weighed with uncommon gravity. What had been found in Diana's old room could not be unseen, and it could not be unlearned. The question was no longer whether the institution would respond, but how deliberately it would choose to do so. The first step was containment, not in the sense of concealment, but control. Senior aides agreed that any further examination would proceed slowly, with oversight layered thickly enough to prevent misinterpretation or leakage. The materials identified would be reviewed by a small, rotating group bound by confidentiality protocols so strict they bordered on ceremonial. No copies would be made, no summaries circulated beyond those cleared to receive them. In an institution shaped by hard lessons, speed was the enemy. There was also a discussion of precedent. Diana's legacy has always occupied a unique space, one where personal grief intersects with public ownership. Any action taken now would inevitably be measured against past choices, some widely criticized, others reluctantly defended. Advisors cautioned that reopening her private record too broadly could invite demands for transparency, which the monarchy was neither legally required to meet nor structurally prepared to do so. Once one door opens, others tend to follow. William's influence in this phase was quiet but decisive. Those close to the process noted his insistence on accuracy over narrative. He did not want an interpretation. He wanted facts, reconciled cleanly and conclusively. His concern was not reputation in the abstract, but trust in the long term. A monarchy that appears to curate truth selectively risks something more dangerous than scandal. It risks disbelief. And once disbelief is set in, it is nearly impossible to reverse. Charles, for his part, leaned toward resolution without spectacle. He has lived long enough to understand that history does not soften simply because it is ignored. Yet he also knows that not every truth needs to be performed publicly to be honored privately. The balance he sought acknowledged the discovery internally, corrected what could be corrected, and allowed the institution to move forward without reopening emotional fault lines that serve no present good. For the staff involved, the aftermath carried a quieter weight. They returned to their routines with a sharpened awareness that even the most carefully managed environments hold hidden chapters. Some spoke privately of a renewed respect for the fragility of record-keeping. Others reflected on the strange intimacy of standing in a space once occupied by someone who still shapes their working lives decades later. Diana, they realized, was not just history. She was context. What happens next may never be announced. There may be no statement, no clarification, no public reckoning. Instead, the resolution may take the form the monarchy knows best: adjusted records, corrected archives, silent alignment between fact and file. To some, that will feel insufficient. To others, it will feel responsible. The institution will continue as it always has, carrying its past forward carefully, selectively, and with an awareness of how easily memory can destabilize power. In the end, what was found in Diana's old room did not demand answers so much as it demanded humility, a recognition that even the most controlled institutions are shaped by the people who pass through them, and that some presences linger long after the door is closed. The room may be sealed again. The files may be reconciled, but Diana's shadow, as ever, remains. Diana's room has been closed again, its contents carefully returned to silence, but what it revealed cannot be undone. It reminded the palace, and perhaps all of us, that history is never as settled as we believe. Some truths do not disappear with time. They wait, quietly, behind locked doors, until circumstances force them back into the light. The monarchy will move forward as it always does, guided by restraint and calculation. Yet Diana's presence endures not as a scandal, but as an unfinished memory. And in that persistence lies the real lesson. What we choose to preserve and what we choose to conceal always shapes what comes next.